Making It Work is brought to you by the Max Dupree Center for Leadership at Fuller Theological Seminary and the Theology of Work Project.
Welcome to Making It Work.
Through conversation, scripture, and stories, we invite God into work's biggest challenges so that you can live out your purpose in the workplace.
I'm Mark Roberts.
And I'm Leah Archibald. And this is Making It Work. How can you get your startup idea in front of venture capitalists? How can you get your new baby to sleep at night? These are questions that would be good to bring to a mentor, someone who's not only been there before, but someone who knows you and cares about you and your future. No matter what stage of life you're in, a mentor can be integral to helping you achieve your goals and helping you grow as a person. Today, we're talking about the practical aspects of mentorship. How do you find a mentor? How do you approach that person? And when you're across the table from each other, whether it's in person or virtually, what do you actually start talking about? Our guest, Bill Hendricks, has had a long career as a consultant, helping individuals and organizations develop their potential. His writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, and he's the author of many books on work and calling, including his latest book, Men of Influence, The Transformational Impact of Godly Mentors. Bill Hendricks, welcome to the Making It Work podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, Leah and Mark. I'm very excited to be with you guys today. Thanks.
Great.
Thank you. It's so exciting to have you. So would you start us off giving an example of how mentorship works? And I wonder if you have a story from your own career that you could talk about.
Absolutely. I've been blessed with countless mentors. And really, I don't know if it's so much my career, but the very first one was my seventh grade teacher, Mr. Gibson. And the problem was that fifth grade had been a very bad year. I kind of limped through sixth grade. Then comes seventh grade, and a new teacher, Mr. Gibson, shows up, and he instantly recognized that I was somebody who needed to be given lots and lots of, extra projects and extra assignments, but good assignments. He began to recognize, I think, maybe some leadership ability, and he also recognized some musical ability. He played the piano, I played the trombone. He put together a group of us that began to perform together. He saw in a little boy who was becoming a young man some potential that apparently the fifth grade teacher had overlooked. I didn't think about it that way at the time, but here was an older person who was having an actual influence that was shaping my life and even my character, and I've never forgotten him. And if it hadn't have been for him, there are many paths I think I probably would never have taken. And so at the core of mentorship is the way one life impacts or influences another life.
And it's amazing to me. Probably it's not amazing, actually, because we all have stories about this in our life, how much one older person has influenced us. That you're still, when I ask you to give me an example of mentorship, you're telling me about your seventh grade teacher. Like that's reaching pretty far back.
Decades ago, yes.
No, that's not what I meant, Bill.
That's a long time ago, right?
Well, I'm trying to underscore your point, Leah.
Yeah.
That somebody who was long ago and far away, nevertheless, still has had an impact on somebody's life decades later. That's the power of mentoring.
Yeah. And is that kind of the definition that you would give to mentorship, or how do you define it?
Yeah, I mean, I've done the research on this, and one study shows that in the literature there's literally 150 different definitions of mentor out there. The simplest that I'm aware of is that a mentor is really not sort of defined objectively. It's almost subjective by the person who says to themselves, if it hadn't been for blank, and then they fill in a name, I wouldn't be the person that I am today. And so as our listeners all think about, who is it that you look back on and you say, gosh, if it hadn't been for so and so, I would never have become, in a positive way, the person that I've become today. That would be a person we would define as a mentor.
Hmm. Bill, do you think we often kind of luck into these mentorship relationships based on who's above us in the workplace?
Well, I do. And it's unfortunate that we're not more intentional about it because they're so valuable. I actually think that mentoring is something that God has built into the fabric of humanity as a way for people to grow and develop and mature. And I say that on the basis of not just personal examination over the years, but actually through the work that I have done professionally in ascertaining people's what we call their giftedness. Giftedness is what you're born to do. It's really what God has designed you to do. And what I've discovered, and this is after spending in-depth time to ferret out the giftedness of, I estimate, about 2,000 individuals over the last 25 years. I've discovered that there's an element in a person's motivational makeup that we call a modeling individual. That's a fancy technical term in our scheme for what typically we'd call a mentor, a guide, a coach, a tutor, a sponsor. That element shows up in roughly 75 to 85% of people's motivational patterns. And what I'm suggesting here is that probably somewhere around 3/4 or more of people, it's not just like, a mentor would be a real nice thing to have. It's just kind of a luxury. No. For those people, a mentor type person is actually a requirement for them to function optimally. And without that element, they don't function nearly as well as they could. In fact, they may really struggle. I could show you cases of people where when they have a mentor type person, that modeling individual in their life, they're on top of the world. They're really making progress. They're performing well, functioning well. No mentor figure, they go right in the pits. And they're shocked when you point that out to them. But I say to them, look, you're not looking for a job. You're looking for a person. You're looking for a modeling individual. You need a mentor. And you need to get intentional about finding these people because it's that important for you.
Hmm. So I hear you saying, Bill, that mentorship really is in the DNA of many people to really strive to have that modeling individual in their life. Do you see that also modeled in Scripture? I mean, do you
Yep.
have that like a biblical basis for mentorship?
Yeah, in the book of Proverbs, there's a very interesting proverb. Proverbs are sort of collections of wise sayings. And there's one of them that says, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. Now, I think in our culture, we have this image in our mind that these are like two swords that are somehow coming together to sharpen each other. It's actually a misreading of the context. Actually, you would never bang swords together to sharpen them, because prior to about the time the Proverbs was written, all the implements of war as well as agriculture were copper, and if you bang them together to try to sharpen them, copper's very brittle. You'd break them. But this proverb was written about the time when iron became dominant, and with iron, you wouldn't file it down like we might think today, because pretty soon you'd have no iron left. You'd shave all the iron off. So what people would do with whether it's a sword or a spear, an implement of like a plow, over time the implement gets dull. And so the way you'd sharpen it back out is you would take iron, like a mallet, and you'd beat on that iron until you had a nice sharp edge again. And that way you could retain the iron, but you'd also sharpen it out. But the properties of iron were needed in order to sharpen the iron, right? And so what the proverb does is the way the Hebrew works is it just sets two thoughts side by side and lets you do the math. And so it says, iron sharpens iron. one person sharpens another. And so you step back and you go, what's this analogy? Iron sharpens iron. Well, that means that the properties of iron sharpen iron. So the properties of people sharpen other people. And I think the way we would say it today is we as human beings have a tendency to rub off on each other, right? Like if you hang around people, after a while, you start to kind of use some of their same language and maybe even copy some of their behaviors and they've had an influence on you. Well, that's the idea behind this proverb, is that people are going to have an influence on each other. And I think what the proverb is really getting at is we need to bring people into our lives who will make us better people. But the way that happens is a life-on-life sort of interaction in which they say things to us, do things with us, put us onto tasks, give us feedback, and otherwise begin to shape our lives so that we move in a direction that's positive and life-giving, and we thrive and the world flourishes. We call that a mentor. Conversely, we intentionally are on the lookout for people that probably could benefit from someone having a positive influence on them. So you got the two sides. Everybody either needs to be a mentor or they need a mentor, and it's frankly both. We, as humans, we both need to be mentored, but we also, increasingly as we get older, need to become mentors.
Okay, so you've convinced me. Let's say I want to go out and I say, I need one of these. I need to find a mentor for my career. How do I do it? Who do I look for? How do I approach them? What do I say?
Yeah. Well, let me be counterintuitive. The first word of both advice and caution, frankly, I'd give is whatever you do, don't use the term mentor. Okay. If you let's say that I'm a 20-something.
Is that like asking someone to marry you on the first date? Is that kind of what?
But basically, it's yes, they will have a deer in the headlights look, and you'll get a no real quickly. You'll spook them. But let's take young adults. I work with a lot of people in their 20s, and I believe that what most young adults really need more than anything else is an older adult to come and essentially invite them into the adult world of work, which we can call mentoring. But I would never advise a young adult, somebody who's 25, 27 or whatever, to, invite somebody who's in their 40s out for a cup of coffee instead and say, would you mentor me? Because as I say, in our culture, this idea of mentoring has all these connotations of, you've got to be this wise sage. You've got to be a Yoda. You've got to be a Obi-Wan Kenobi who, every word that comes out of your mouth is worth capturing for posterity. And you've got all this gravitas. And most people look at themselves and they're like, I don't have any of that. I'm just me. I don't belong mentoring anybody. Why I've made so many mistakes in life. And, that there's a lot of excuses people will make that say disqualify them as mentors. So let's turn it around. Then how would you positively go look for a mentor? Well, first of all, I think you kind of size up people say at work. The workplace is one of the best places to be on the lookout for a mentor. You find somebody that you look at and you go, they do certain things that I'd like to emulate, that I'd like to learn about. They seem like they have something to offer. Maybe there's just a chemistry involved. Frankly, it could start out with what I call top-level matters. I distinguish between top-level issues and more core issues. Top-level issues are things like, okay, I'm new at this company. How do things work around here? Or, I'm young in my career, and I've been asked to run a meeting. And I think about it, and I'm like, I've been in a lot of meetings, but I've never had the responsibility to run a meeting. I wonder how you do that. Or, I'm in my job, and I've been promoted into this new role, and now they've told me I've got to hire somebody. And I don't know I've never hired anybody. Like, where do you start? How do you do that?
It seems like an easier ask than asking someone to be your
Exactly.
for you.
Exactly. So you find somebody who's just a little further down the trail than you, and you say, "Look, could I get a few minutes? I need to ask some questions about how to do this thing." And that's a good place to start. And that is a form of mentoring. And what often happens when somebody's sort of showing you the ropes on something like that, you get to start to know them as a person and vice versa. Because, if anybody has any emotional intelligence, they generally go, well, tell me a little bit about you. Tell me a little bit about your background, or, you just, as humans, we do like to sort of have a comfort level with who we're dealing with. And so we get information about each other that's not always directly work related. It's more on the personal side. And as that happens, we begin to get a window into what drives this person and what makes them tick. But also they begin to get to know us a little bit, and they maybe find out, some of our concerns, some of our fears, some of our aspirations. And that's where the core issues start to begin to come into play.
Mark, let me ask you, I know you work with a lot of people of different ages. Has anyone ever approached you and asked you to kind of be Yoda for them?
When Bill said that, again, Bill is, evoking all these memories for me. So I think the first time anybody ever used the word mentor in my life in that way, I was actually out at Lady Lodge Family Camp where I worked. And on the first day, six adult men came up to me and said, "We would like you to mentor us this week." Now,
Man.
my
Yes,
first
like
response,
they ambushed you.
well, yeah, and the thing was, I was probably 55. They were around 45. So my first thought is, "Oh my gosh, they must think I'm really old." And then my next thought was, I don't know if I have anything to give these guys.
Right.
And so but we began a conversation, and as we got into it, I realized, they just want me to talk about life and parenting and family and share some of mine and get to know them. And so once we sort of unpacked what it was, but it was the first time in my life, one of the first times I thought, oh my gosh, I'm looked upon as older. And then exactly as Bill said, well, do I really have anything here? And as we began to live into that, it was really a sweet and a positive thing, not only being in over the course of a week. It is funny. I there are people who now will refer to me as having mentored them.
Right.
And I'll think, yeah, I guess that was it. But I don't think any of them ever approached me that way, nor did I approach them that way. And honestly, some of it was, as I've learned, people deciding to be like me in some way. So it wasn't just what I was saying. It was, the fact that I cared about them a lot. And then they're thinking, wow, I need to really care for the people that, that I'm working with too, that sort of thing.
Now, when I read your book, Bill, I actually was surprised by how practical it was. You give a lot of tips, not only how to find a mentor, but how to relate to that person and how to suss out whether that person, has room in their life to be a mentor. Like, are they emotionally available? Do they seem interested in you? Are they available for conversation? I found it incredibly practical. And so I have to say, your book is titled Men of Influence. Is mentorship just for men, or can women benefit from this too?
98% of that book is applicable to women as well as men. But yes, since I'm a man, I thought, well, let me at least speak to the men, but I still think 98% of this, women, it applies equally so. But I claim to be no expert in mentoring women.
What do you think about mentorship relationships across
gender?
Yeah.
I'm fine about it with obvious cautions and boundaries. I mean, I believe that every person that God has made probably has something to teach someone else of either gender. let's just take our schools, which in some ways teaching is very akin to mentoring. I mean, for generations, for millennia, we've had men teaching women and women teaching men in schools and so forth with great benefit. And I don't see why that suddenly changes when we just get out in the work world. And I've had the benefit of being mentored, if you will, by many women that have been just incredibly invaluable in my life. And likewise, I've had women who tell their friends and others, Bill's been a real mentor to me. I suppose there's some issues that if a woman asks me, what do I think about such and so, I'd shy away and say, I just don't feel comfortable speaking about that as a man. That's just, I don't know. I don't know what I'd have to say. I wear a second hat. We have a leadership center called the Hendricks Center. And we have a team of about a dozen people there. And we do readings as a team. And a couple of years ago, we did readings on issues that take place commonly for women that men just, it's not even on the radar for them. They don't think about it until somebody points it out. But they ought to. As leaders, they need to be aware. And I'm talking about things like, what does it really mean for a woman to feel like she's the one woman in a room of 8 men or on a team of 8 men? And it was just really helpful to me as a man to realize how much I don't know. So, if a woman came to me and asked me about some of those kind of issues, I'd say, listen, you're asking somebody who just is ignorant about a lot of that stuff. And I can tell you what I know, but I can tell you even more what I don't know. So I'm not the right person to mentor you on that.
Well, at the same time, being a woman in the work world, I've spent my whole career at different business, in business. And for the majority of my career, I'm still young, I'm 39 now, but everybody above me has mostly usually been a man,
Right.
So, and I would call many of those men people I learned the ropes from, and certainly even people who speak into my life. My current boss is a man, and I think of him absolutely as a mentor and a confidant and someone who can very gracefully tell me when I'm wrong. And because I trust him a lot, I can gracefully take that feedback. But I think for a lot of women, especially in settings where you don't see a lot of women, let's say in the world, it can be a little bit more challenging to cross those barriers and develop a deep relationship with a man, until there's a high level of trust in that person's integrity.
Mm. Bill and Lee, I really appreciate what you're saying, both out of my own life experience, but I also think that in our current world, it's still true that men tend to have more power and influence in many, many organizations, and that mentoring is a very a common channel for advancement in organizations. And so if men don't mentor women, that's really holding women back in a way that I think isn't just, not a good idea. I mean, I think it's really unjust. Now, having said that, obviously we have to be careful in certain ways when we enter into relationships with somebody of the opposite sex, and there are things that we need to think about. And I'm sure you do, Bill, and you do, Leah. But I really feel like it's a moral obligation for men in power or women to mentor people without regard to whether they're men or women, but in particular for men to pay attention to women who really need and deserve mentoring. And so I so appreciate what you've said, but I would almost say, this is something we really need to pay attention to, because it's super easy for me as a man to just sort of pay attention to men because they're more like me, and it feels easier, and I need to work not to do that only.
I think it's also easy, for me as a younger woman in the workplace, I have a fear of asking for feedback, because I'm not going to ask an older man to give me feedback on something because I want to show that I can do it all by myself without anybody's help, whereas a younger man would be less reticent to reach out and therefore kickstart that mentorship relationship. So I think part
Yeah,
of the, onus on women too is to put themselves out there, for the
absolutely.
kind
And,
of
and
feedback that you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation.
yeah. And Bill, like you, I've had women who have mentored me. In fact, right now, my board chair, I'm part of the Dupree Center at Fuller. My board chair is a woman, and though we don't have a meet every month and talk about things, I mean, she has certainly been a mentor to me, a very wise presence and a person whose way of being I have noted and have imitated. And that's been an invaluable relationship. So again, I'm really glad you raised that question, Leah, and glad, Bill, for your perspective on it.
Well, Leah, you mentioned it's common for someone to have some personal doubts or fears, various places along their career. And yes, to sort of mask those with a certain bravado, but, deep down in one's soul, if they're intimidated by something or they're doubtful or whatever, that's there. And I feel a responsibility, the older I get, as well as whatever position of influence I have and position of authority, to kind of be on the lookout for my younger coworkers and try to find and provide safe spaces for them to articulate some of those feelings, because I believe by doing that, that in and of itself is helpful for them, and it will form them in some useful, beneficial way. The fact that somebody who's, I'm 66, so the fact that somebody who's maybe like 30 um, is feels safe enough to say, "Wow, I'm so embarrassed by what I said at that last meeting." You know, the fact that they can even openly tell me that, I feel honored to even be able to hear that. But I also feel like in providing that space for them to do that, I've opened up a path for them forward, like that's no longer a deep dark secret. That they now feel some confidence that, well, sometimes we say things we regret. What could we have done differently? But also the fact that I'm still standing here on the other side of it, and the sun came up this morning. It's not the end of the world. So we'll learn from this and move on. I mean, I think that's how humans grow. Um, I will tell you that a great deal of the work that I do in what I guess you'd call mentoring, and this is aside from the stuff that I'm not aware of, obviously, but most of the questions that people bring to me are not informational questions. Most of the questions are some form of the statement, I don't know what I'm doing here. Like I mentioned some of these. I have to hire somebody. I'm not exactly sure how to go about doing that. I have to make a decision. I'm not quite sure how to make that decision. Um, I'm facing a choice, um, and I've got these two people that are at odds with each other, and my job is to help them get along. How do you do that? And the answer is, well, nobody knows how to do that, because the truth is nobody's ever faced this exact situation until you just brought it. Now, there's people that have faced similar situations. What have they done that's been productive or not productive? And what can we learn from that? If I was in your shoes, here's some questions I'd be asking. Um, and basically just you dialogue so that maybe between the two of us, we can come up with a few thoughts as to what you might do. Now, armed with that, why don't you go, to figure out exactly how you're going to do this, and then I'll walk alongside you and let's debrief afterwards and kind of see where we go. I think that's how knowledge workers basically learn, and they learn by going through real time things together and seeing what happens. But somebody used the word trust, and I think trust is a big part of what's going on here. Is somebody trusts me to be there for them, and I'm trustworthy to walk with them as they take a growth step.
Bill, you mentioned three characters from the New Testament,
Yes.
Paul, Barnabas, and Timothy, who are all people who worked together. They were co-workers in different aspects, but also, across maybe some generational lines. What
Mhm.
in their story can inform our ideas of, how we mentor or be mentored today?
Yeah, Paul was the apostle, and he wrote quite a bit of the New Testament. And so we sort of see in him, I guess, what I'd call the sage. Here's a person with quite a bit of perspective and insight. Um, and so he, in mentoring, sort of represents somebody who's got a lot of perspective that's valuable and that we can learn from because he knows a lot, has been through a lot, has a character that is seasoned with all the adversity he'd been through, as well as all the time he had spent uh, praying and spending time with the Lord. And so he's kind of a father figure in a sense, and he even uses that kind of language when he writes his young protege Timothy in First and Second Timothy, as well as others. Barnabas was a peer to Paul. He was basically, as I perceive it, not only maybe the same age, but maybe a little older. But the point is that we remember Barnabas because as Paul was getting started in his venture of being an evangelist and an apostle, Barnabas was the sponsor. Barnabas opened the door for him with the church at Jerusalem when nobody wanted anything to do with him. And it says that Barnabas accompanied him on the first missionary journey. And so you get this idea that here's somebody who's more or less at my level, but they're walking alongside with me. And I'm giving input to them, and they're giving input to me. Um, and of course, it's interesting that Paul and Barnabas actually had a falling out over another young person that Barnabas was mentoring named John Mark. And they had to kind of patch that up later. And so sometimes, you'll have a mentor that you disagree with, and that happens. And then Timothy is the young up and coming leader person who they're building into. They're preparing for the next generation. And what you sort of perceive in this is it's like a baton race, a relay race where they're passing off the baton to one another. And so there's a generational aspect to mentoring that's huge here. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of it. When I invest in the life of someone younger than me, I'm very definitely investing in the future.
Bill, I love you're just making me think about all kinds of things, but the relationship of Paul and Timothy, and you're right. He definitely refers in
My
several
son.
places as my son or my child in the Lord. And yet he also in other places, like when he writes to the Thessalonians, he refers to Timothy as our brother,
Mhm.
and then literally a co-worker of God.
Right.
It's amazing phrase. And so what you see there is sort of the layered relationship, right? That on the one hand, there's a father-son and a deep affection, right, in this
Mhm.
relationship. And then there's also a brother-to-brother relationship, and there's also a fellow servant of God co-worker relationship. And they're all sort of layered in together uh, in this sort of intimate and sort of multivariate kind of relationship that would be often true of mentoring relationships as well in today's world.
Mark, these sweet words from Paul to Timothy are in 1 Thessalonians 3, verse 2, where he calls
Mhm.
Timothy God's co-worker. I want to harp on a little more of the sourness that Bill brought about in
Yeah.
that story, because in addition to having such sweet relationships with mentors, which we've mostly talked about in this podcast, or people we choose as mentors, or maybe we don't choose, are human beings, and going back to the fight that you mentioned between Paul and Barnabas, they're passing ways. This happens in Acts chapter 15, verses 36 to 41. It talks about the whole fight that they had. But it said they had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. I mean, something was really going on. So, my question to you is, when we choose a mentor or pick a mentor or fall into a mentorship relationship, we're aware that this person is going to be a human being. How do we set expectations appropriately?
Well, just as you say, we got to really calibrate our expectations. Any human being that we have in our life, sooner or later, will disappoint us or rub us the wrong way. Our heroes, all including mentors, have feet of clay. Sooner or later, we're going to find something in their character, in their background, in just the way they look at life or treat people or something, and we go, boy, that I don't like that. I don't want to be like that, or that's really problematic for me. And yeah, sometimes in order to protect ourselves and do what's right, we have to set some boundaries and even walk away. If somebody just goes off the deep end and does something really, really hurtful and despicable, with tremendous regret, we may have to put distance between ourselves and them, and then do what Jesus taught us to do, which was to pray for them and pray for their restoration. But you gotta know that any human that you interact with, sooner or later, you're going to see something that you go, man, that's not right. And of course, they're going to see that in you as well.
It's such an important reminder because it is true. And, sometimes it's not big things. Sometimes it is big things. One of those, if I were to list out, the top 20 mentors in my life, probably somebody in the top 5 turned out to have been unfaithful to his wife. And that was devastating to me.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't invalidate the incredible influence he had in my life. But what it actually did, it actually sort of helped me to kind of reframe a lot of things in life and realize that, I know this is going to sound like Sunday school, but in the end, we really have one mentor, really.
That's
right?
correct.
Only Jesus will be always faithful and always reliable. And so what you're saying, it keeps us from almost a possible idolatry, right? Of holding up a human being too high.
Yes.
Which doesn't mean we don't take seriously sin. And I know you're not saying that, neither am I. But it does put things in a perspective that allows us to receive the goodness and the giftedness of people, and at the same time acknowledge their humanness and realize that really, in the end, I really want Jesus to be my mentor most of all, and he will never fail.
And, by the same token, that's an interesting observation that you bring up. I've also had mentors who, as people, I guess you'd say, as their character, they were not people that I wanted to emulate. I mean, I had a professor once in one of my graduate programs, I won't get into which one, who was frankly a misogynist, and I hated it. But the guy knew something about the discipline that we were studying that was just fascinating. And he was almost a different person when we got on that. And I learned a great deal from him. So, even people that look like rotten apples on the outside, and to some extent are on the inside, nonetheless, they turn out to have qualities or knowledge or something that's quite valuable that we can still learn from or benefit from. And by that token, later on, we look back and you go, yeah, that person actually was a kind of a mentor to me. It's interesting how that can work in this world.
That gives me a lot of hope, actually, for any of us who might want to be potential mentors one day.
Yep.
That we don't have to be perfect ourselves. That we can offer whatever it is that we have, and God can use that in some way.
Well, oddly, the fact that we prove that we're human actually raises our esteem in somebody's eyes. Like, now they'll listen to us. They thought, Bill just that's just Bill. Of course, Bill's going to be able to do that because that's Bill. He can do everything right. And then they start to realize, Bill's human like I am. Well, if that's the case, maybe he struggles with some of the same things I do, or maybe he has struggled with some of the same things I have. Maybe he's a little more approachable than I thought. Because as you say, we can get bedazzled by people above us and get intimidated as a result. And so we don't access what they really have to offer. Again, I find myself so many times when somebody comes to me and they put their situation on the table, I couldn't even begin to tell you how many times I've looked at it and inside I'm thinking, I don't have a clue what to say to you, And so what do? Well, you say, boy, that's a tough one. And then I do one of two things. I either ask a few more questions to make sure I'm clear on it. What I think I mostly do is I go, I've never faced that exact situation, but let me tell you a story about, something I have faced that is somewhat perhaps illuminating as to, if nothing else, the fact that I empathize with them.
So in the same way, to bring our conversation back to the Proverbs 27, verse 17, in the same way that iron sharpens iron, the way that we become better humans is by being humans with each other, displaying our humanness to one another.
Exactly. I think I try to do this somewhat intentionally, to be cautiously vulnerable, if I could use that word. I'm not one of these people that, spews out every terrible thing that's ever happened in my life. But I want the person to, first of all, not be intimidated. And secondly, to know that I don't have it all figured out. And one way I put it, Leah, is particularly when somebody says, "Oh man, you're so wise," or something to that effect, and I go, "Look, I'm the world's best expert on my own opinion. Okay, whether any of it rises to the level of wisdom, that's for you to decide. But I use that little bit of humor and self-deprecation just to let them know, hey, I don't really have it all figured out. In fact, in some ways, I got more questions than you have. But I don't think people are looking for answers nearly as much as they're looking for a person to engage with them as they walk through life. That to me is the real sizzle in whatever we call mentoring. Here's another person who seems to care enough to listen to me, to attend to me as a person, and then is willing to kind of walk with me as I walk my path. That's a pretty valuable thing.
Man, that sure is. In fact, that was a great wrap up. I think, what you just said. So if I'm thinking about maybe, could I be a mentor or not? That might be an intimidating question. If I think, could I find somebody that I could walk along in life with, walk along through work with, and share in life and share some of myself and be there for that person, that has a really different feel. It makes it an open invitation. And then, in light of our most recent conversation about sort of the shortcomings of mentors, it also means I don't have to be superhuman. I can be human. I can be open. But it's really about that sharing of life. So I love the way you put that. I think that was just a great statement.
Yeah. Thank you. Bill, thank you so much for walking alongside us in this conversation.
Well, you're certainly welcome. Thanks for having me on the podcast today.
That's our show. Don't miss the next episode. Be sure to subscribe.
And if you like what you've heard, please leave a review. We'd love to hear from you, and it helps other people find us. Thanks for listening.